Okay, there we go. Welcome everybody. Welcome back for many of you to the Gadamer reading group. And this this bi-month, we're doing a piece that I actually taught once. I taught a course on phenomenology and hermeneutics, and this was like the transition piece because Gadamer speaks so much about his criticism of classical phenomenology. Let me sort of set up the transition from phenomenology to hermeneutics, and also he sort of navigates his relation to Heidegger as well. So I'm excited to talk about this piece. It's nice and very readable. And it's always nice to come across a Gadamer piece that's easy to assign for students because it's not always the case where you can find sort of a self-contained nugget that does not go off on interesting but not always easy tangents for undergraduates. So traditionally, the way I start is that if someone has something they're so excited about, they cannot bear to wait to talk about this topic in a reading. Uh, why don't you go ahead and raise your hand or speak up, and we'll jump right in. Yes, Eric.
This is very trivial, but it like stood out to me in a glaring way because I was asking this when I was assigned Truth and Method to read as an undergrad.
Hmm.
And I remember like arguing with my professor at the time, like, oh, he's just saying what Sartre's saying, or something like this. And so I was shocked on 106 that Gadamer mentions Sartre by name
Yeah,
and then mentions Merleau-Ponty. Like usually he seems like the French are below me to engage with, you know? And so I guess I was surprised that he would even drop their names there. And I realize that this is trivial, but it has to do with like the politics of philosophy that I was kind of understanding Gadamer to kind of be German centric in his kind of admission of influences on his own thinking. But
right.
here it was kind of surprising to just see that, oh, but I'm more than happy to drop Sartre or Merleau-Ponty at times. Is that
Sure.
something that people have? I feel like people have talked about this before, like his kind of, I don't know, lack of engagement with French phenomenology.
So he does have a review of Being in Nothingness that hasn't been translated, but he hardly ever mentions Merleau-Ponty or Levinas, but he will mention them now and again. But he doesn't engage with them. It's not like he takes up any of their works in a discussion.
Oh,
But this talk was given in Spain originally, so that may have been part of it. Maybe he felt like it was a more cosmopolitan audience, and he had to bring in these other figures.
I
John,
seem to recall, David. I seem to recall he gave it. He did give a talk on Sartre somewhere. It's somewhere in the collected essays.
yeah,
Um, and but uh, but I think he thinks that, like, I think he would see a lot of what is in Merleau-Ponty as um, basically Husserl.
mm,
Husserl had already gone there, and I think that's he's making that point here. Specifically with the phrase phenomenology of perception. He's well
right.
aware that, that's the title of Merleau-Ponty's book. And and then of course Merleau-Ponty would bring in the Gestalt psychology as well, which is something that Husserl was going the other way against, that,
Right,
at
right.
any rate. But yeah, I could probably, I think it's in one of those Yale collections
Mm,
of things. There is something on Sartre somewhere.
okay.
Maybe it's in another one on the one on education or something. But I
Okay.
recall, like, I took a course from Gadamer and I wrote a paper on it, and I have the transcript of four 2-hour seminars that he gave on um, the letter on humanism.
Mm,
And um, I just did the OCR thing with my assistant the other day on that paper. It's 30-page paper. And so he was quite well aware. He could read French. He lectured in French. He's quite well aware of Heidegger's critique of Sartre, and Sartre's sort of. But that existentialism was. But he's never. I don't think he's never really like put down Sartre like the way some Heideggerians or a lot of French people did, like even Ricoeur and all those people in the 90s and the
Yeah.
80s.
He doesn't degrade them. He just doesn't spend
Yeah,
extended
yeah.
time on.
Yeah, because he doesn't think there's anything original there that's really significant. Because what they have either came from, yeah, mostly like Merleau-Ponty did spend a lot of time in the Husserl archives at Louvain
Yeah.
and the earlier Merleau-Ponty. Yeah, and he's quite different from Sartre as well, as you all know.
Right. Yeah, but you're right, Eric. Those are rare references when they come up. They sort of jump out at you.
I agree.
Other thoughts about where to start?
Okay, well, I just noticed something. Now, I
Oh,
have to say that it often does happen that I'm not prepared for these meetings, but I was browsing through this thing really quickly.
yeah.
And if no one's going to pipe up, I can offer this. It's also on page 106,
Okay.
106, and it's referenced to at the bottom. One's bodily actuality
Yes.
is not what one notices of one's body, one's senses when one does not feel well. It rather consists of our fully being given over to the here, da, to what captivates us, lets us be awake in the actual course of thinking, to speak with Aristotle. So that's sort of the passage and going forward that I'm a bit intrigued about.
Yeah. So on this page,
Mm-hmm.
actually, he turns to page before he talks about what Husserl gave us that was so helpful. And this
Mm-hmm.
page he sort of goes through a list of problems with Husserlian phenomenology, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's time consciousness, there's pure perception, there's intersubjectivity, there's the account of perception, and then there's the account of the body, right? And that's what you're talking about at the bottom of 106 there, right?
Mm-hmm.
As well as the next page, we'll talk about methodology. So yeah, I mean, that's another topic that is prominent in phenomenology and in existential phenomenologists that Gadamer doesn't have much to say about. So it is interesting when something like this comes up.
Yeah, I think it comes up this whole notion of the da,
They're there or
or
the
there, yeah.
sure.
And this whole idea of being captivated. It's just that he highlights that as being significant because I seem to recall it coming up in other texts by Gadamer, such as the language of metaphysics somewhere or other. But I'm
Okay.
just wondering how significant that is to his own position, or if he, just attributes that exclusively to Husserl in the body, or if he's reading something else in there himself when he starts tracing it back to Aristotle and Erigeia and Entelikeia. So these kinds of connections are not the kind that I would expect anyone except Gadamer to make.
So I see him here as taking up Heidegger's critique of Husserl,
Okay.
not as praising Husserl's kind of body, but taking up in the
Mm-hmm.
Da of Dasein,
Mm-hmm.
being there of Dasein. Um, and so the body is not. Wait, so yeah, the real mystery of our consists in this, that the actual being the body is not an object of consciousness, lets us be awake to the actual course of thinking. So I take that to be something that's part of Heidegger's account of the body and of Dasein's being there
Mm-hmm.
with a kind of Aristotelian way of speaking. But Eric, do you want to speak to this?
No, I mean,
Oh,
this is great, and I'm happy to talk about it. If you're collecting a list of topics that we're going to go through eventually, I've got one to add to the list too. That's all.
Sure.
But yeah, I was noticing this too about like the kind of the impossibility of objectifying our bodies to ourselves because our bodies are the very medium of
mhm.
being here, right? Like, and that's brought out more through Heidegger than through Husserl.
Right.
But but like it just seems cruel. Like Husserl's awesome, and Gadamer's just jumping on the anti-Husserl bandwagon. Like, I mean, Husserl's not dumb, right? Like he knows that the body is like this. He's not like
Right.
anyway.
No, and and Merleau-Ponty ends the paragraph before this, and Merleau-Ponty ends this paragraph. So that might be the context in which Gadamer is talking about the body. And Merleau-Ponty explicitly got his account of the body from Husserl from the archives. Like John mentioned, he was one of the first people to go to the archives and focused on ideas too and other writings of Husserl's that were on the body that aren't published yet. Um, but he also understood himself to be moving beyond Husserl in sort of placing the body as the point at which we are open to the world. And I think Gadamer is taking that up as well. I mean, in some ways, in Husserl, even though you have this, like he says, uh, exquisitely subtle account of the body, it also functions as a limitation for us, right? It's also something that through the phenomenology of reduction, we have to see the ways we can get beyond. Otherwise, we will not arrive at apodictic evidence. It will always be sort of contingent on our particular situatedness in the world. So it has this limitation for Husserl, in which it doesn't for Merleau-Ponty. Does that sound fair? Anyone else want to weigh in on my take on Husserl and Merleau-Ponty here? What is the other thing you wanted to get to? I'll make sure I'll mark it down right now.
Oh, I want to add two other things to the list.
Yes.
He's doing a lot of woke propaganda in this essay. He wants to advocate for wokeness, and I am on the MAGA train. I do not like this talk about being woke. Just like the last paragraph where he's like, Aristotle denoted the supreme entity which is always present to itself, and he characterized the divine being in terms of man's highest possibility as energia actus prius and wakefulness, right? Like, and he
All right.
talks about being awake multiple times throughout the essay.
Yeah.
And I'm joking about the MAGA stuff. I like the woke project, and that Gadamer is aligned with that. So I want to make sure to talk about that. But then also on the last pages, starting really on 109, I thought a long time ago that I read an essay where Gadamer says, Heidegger went this route of poetry, but I kind of prefer dialogue as the kind of essence of language. Right? There's this competition between poetry and dialogue. And although I can never find where Gadamer actually said that, he seems to get close to it on page 109, where he's like, Heidegger goes with like poetry, but I'm going to kind of advocate for dialogue and the dialectic of question answer. So I'm wondering if we could get into this like kind of
Yeah.
competition of priority between poesis and dialectic.
Okay. Good. Great. Yes, Greg.
Yeah, I was just going to say with respect to the Husserl stuff, it seems to me that Gadamer's doing here what he does pretty much every time he talks about Husserl, which is to say Husserl had just an immensely important and necessary idea. We owe to Husserl that we got out of the kind of causal explanatory version of metaphysics that he thinks neo-Kantianism was wrapped up in, and that's fairly traditional. The idea that philosophy is the description of things as we experience them, which is, he takes it to be Husserl's core idea. Gadamer thinks that idea is absolutely right and absolutely important. And his criticisms of Husserl are, it seems to me, always criticisms of Husserl kind of failing to fully make good on his own really great and important idea. So I don't think it's fair to read Husserl as just kind of criticizing Husserl here, just crapping on Husserl. I think he's saying Husserl's absolutely indispensable and important, and we we couldn't have had these other later corrections like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and Hermeneutics had Husserl not gotten the first fundamental idea really right.
Right. No, I think that's right. And he also explicitly credits Husserl for the life world as right as this crucial concept, the true lived experience of the world. Yeah, so we definitely should dig into that and see exactly how he relates himself to Husserl in those pages 105 and 106, and a little bit on 107 as part of the point of reading this particular piece. I wanted to at some point talk about what happens at the end because there's quite a bit on phenomenology and his relation to phenomenology, and as a result, hermeneutics. And metaphysics gets the last paragraph, and I found that sort of baffling. And I also found it quite different from the German. So I don't know if the
Mm.
German is a later edition, if maybe this translation came from an earlier version and he revised it for when it showed up in German. But I think at one point we should we should dig into the German and understand the ways in which the English translation leaves out sections and what that means for how we understand the stuff at the end. Frido.
Yeah, I also have one remark or question regarding Gadamer's comments on Husserl, and I was just wondering, and maybe somebody has thoughts about that. To which extent his portrayal of Husserl is basically the one that we find in Heidegger. So, in which respect Gadamer follows Heidegger he when referring to commenting on Husserl, because to some extent we find the same narrative in, for instance, the early Heidegger, the early Freiburg Heidegger, which Gadamer also references here. He says das Verdienst des jungen Heidegger. What is the English? The achievement, the young Heidegger who deserves the credit on 107.
Right.
So kind of Husserl, the great inventor of phenomenology on the one hand, who on the other hand fell prey to certain dogmatic shortcomings, which Gadamer also lays out to some extent. A dogmatic notion of consciousness. Do we find anything that in Gadamer's portrayal of Husserl that we don't find in Heidegger? Does anyone have thoughts about that? Because I always found Gadamer like quite
Right.
I'm lacking the word for that, but following Heidegger to a great extent, and not always being explicitly critical. So does anyone have thoughts about that?
So
If I may add,
yeah, go ahead,
just
John.
quickly there. Husserl was a Cartesian, and it was Heidegger that really broke with Cartesianism cleanly and made it possible to understand the Greeks for the first time, to give us access to Greek thought, because we were always reading them as epistemologists or something. And that's what Gadamer lays that out, I think, very well, and he does credit Husserl to as far to being a step, then to Heidegger, and then he criticizes Heidegger very subtly, but as much as like he says, he gives credit to Heidegger where credit is due, but he goes beyond Heidegger and doesn't. He goes farther than Heidegger in the end. It doesn't follow Heidegger's, sort of Nietzschean, discarding of philosophy, and metaphysics. So that's in a nutshell. That's how I see it.
Yeah, thanks, John. Hang on a second here. I wrote a paper on this once. I've been looking for it. Here it is, in case anyone wants to read it. My take in this paper, there it is. It should be in the chat. My take was that the main figure for Gadamer was actually Shaler. I mean, Shaler and Heidegger shared a number of criticisms of Husserl, but I think one of the reasons I thought that was just I found that Gadamer sort of following Shaler and Shaler's criticisms. But another one was the point of intersubjectivity, where Gadamer, I think there Gadamer's criticisms of Husserl follow more Shaler than they do Heidegger. If I recall, it was a long time ago. I'm not sure even when that may have been 20 some years ago when I published that piece. Um, but in that essay, what I did is I went through everywhere Gadamer talks about
David,
Husserl.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I didn't get it in the chat. I don't know if
Wait a
other
minute.
people did.
Oh, there. I just
Thank
pressed
you.
send. There we go.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
So I just went through everywhere Gadamer talks about Husserl and tried to map out what exactly, who exactly Gadamer thought he was criticizing when he's criticizing Husserl. What is his image of Husserl that he's criticizing? And I thought I made the case there that Shaler was the main influence. But part of what you say, Frida, I don't know that I never got the sense that Gadamer was bringing anything new to his criticism of Husserl. He was following whoever he was following, whether Shaler or Heidegger or people like Fink or other people who were taking Husserl off in different directions. He was following that crowd rather than breaking new ground. And that was one thing that you mentioned, right? You felt like you followed very closely Heidegger, and there wasn't much actually new here. Isn't that what you're saying, Fredo?
Yeah, one reason why I asked this question is that I find this kind of classical narrative of Heidegger surpassing Husserl, replacing the Cartesianism or so by
Yeah.
hermeneutics of facticity. I find it a bit like simplistic, and it's kind of playing into kind of Heidegger's own narrative that he lays out, but it's not really true. And for instance, we find this kind of Heidegger surpassing Husserl narrative. For instance, I think in work of Theodor Kiesel, in contrast to then people like Stephen Kroll or so, who emphasize much more the continuity. And if Gadamer follows Heidegger's portrayal of Husserl in this regard, then he would, I think, in my view, like also follow this narrative, which is not entirely does not like do all the justice to Heidegger's and Gadamer's deep indebtedness to this figure. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think, and Husserlians have been raising objections to this for 100 years now, or 75 years, right? Say these aren't fair. This isn't a fair reading. And I mean, I think you're right about that. Andrew.
Yeah, coming back to this notion of Husserl and how his reading might differ from Heidegger's. It struck me, David, when you mentioned the last paragraph, when he kind of starts talking about metaphysics and distinguishes it really from ontotheology and moves to put it into an Aristotelian way and starts just talking about energeia and actus purus as wakefulness and seeing. And to what extent that description, which I'm assuming is of the prime mover, the divine being, really dovetails or coordinates with what he says about the soul on page 106. So this is actually consistent with Gadamer's reading of Plato as well, right? Where he maps the soul onto the spinning top, right? Onto other, Plato's cosmology and whatnot, right? So I'm wondering if this marks a break with Husserl. If that's the case, if we can coordinate what he says about the divine being in Aristotle with what he says about the soul when he's criticizing Husserl.
Well, certainly, yeah, I would certainly Husserl as a Cartesian is non-Greek. There's no subjectivity. There's no subject in Greek thought. But you have to get. There's one major change in the history of philosophy, and that's Descartes. Everything gets upside down. Everything gets reversed, and that is the whole curse of modern thought. And Husserl hadn't broken through that. He gave away. He hooked up with the eidetic thinking of Plato, and he gave and he established that as having nothing to do with experience or that a priori element. But the thing is, if you don't get, see, pragmatism and fundamental foundationalism were antinomians. They thought they overcome Cartesian subjectivism. They don't even understand what it is. They didn't. They're just fooling themselves. Heidegger did it, and he was the only person who displaced, sorry for ranting here, Descartes' concept of self-consciousness with an entirely different thing of the self, which is based on time and temporality, and between projection and thrownness and so on, which he refers to here. And you can see him coming up into this, and this is where Heidegger, he shows how Heidegger gets beyond this transcendental idealism or whatever of Husserl, which is Kant, which is really Descartes, really, which is just a different, bring it to a different level. So I mean, that's all here, and he lays it out step by step, and so it's not Husserl's getting a rough ride. I mean, people love to be phenomenologists because it's simple, it's easy. Yeah, we got a method. Okay, well, I'm going to see everything in Heidegger and everything in terms of phenomenology. That's okay. You can do that. But the thing is, it's not, I mean, for Heidegger, for Gadamer, he uses phenomenology as a method of philosophical description. It's right. Husserl it contributed something that is lasting and is valuable. And that's how Heidegger sees all philosophers, but no one has the whole answer, even Heidegger. But it is Descartes is the one historical shift that you got to get right, or you want to understand Heidegger at all, or why he went where he went, or why modern philosophy, as the Gadamer's equally with Heidegger, overcoming modern subjectivism. That's the curse. That's what's screwing us up. That's what we got to free ourselves from. We can't overlook that or belittle that. And Husserl didn't find a way to do that. Heidegger did. Gadamer doesn't necessarily agree entirely with the way Gadamer did it, but he took the temporality of the self and read it back into Plato. It said, and which is Gadamer does not do. Gadamer says we don't need to start. We don't need a new beginning. It's not in Plato at all. But at any rate, there's my little rant on that.
That's okay. I mean,
the criticize me, blow me away if you want.
No, it's fine. No, I mean, what Priya was pointing out. I mean, the critique of the Cartesianism in Husserl is a classic sort of a classic criticism, right? A classic line, and then, but Husserlians have tried to push back against that for generations and saying yes, but once you get into him talking about passive synthesis, once you start talking about the genetic phenomenology, once you're talking about what's going on in the life world and the crisis and the way he historicizes things, it seems like he also recognizes some of the problems with the Cartesian starting point and continues to try to fix phenomenology. So
I agree with that.
try to sort of suggest, but it is, I mean, but I think it's also a classic criticism for a reason. I think a lot of those ideas are there and prominent in Husserl. So, Michael, you've been waiting.
Yeah, I just had a question. So, how can we think about the ideal of the things themselves in this whole ontological critique? How should we understand that? Because that was still a goal of Gadamer, right?
Yeah.
He still thought that was good. That was something worth getting back to the things themselves, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, one class question is what's left of these core Husserlian ideas, like the call to the things themselves?
Because he actually there's a part on 107 in the middle where he actually relates the thing itself to the inner time structure of Dasein that John Beach, I think you were talking about before, and I didn't really get how to understand that relation of the two. It's in the middle of 107 where it starts he gives the example of the ontological critique to illustrate this ontological critique by a single example. And then he says, is not precisely the thing itself which has been missed there. Or he says, Is dread really the exception of a future evil, or is hope the expectation of some future good? Is it not precisely the thing itself which has been missed there, i.e., the inner time structure of our Dasein, which is
Mhm.
present at hand and is not consciousness through having its presence at hand? Does Dasein not itself in the light of the impending and of its own possibilities and know itself to be conditioned by its own past and by its having become what it is? So I didn't really know how to how is he connecting those two things?
Well, it's the concept of the Heidegger's concept of design is a constantly moving temporal structure between projection and thrownness, and it's that's from that's dread itself is an aspect of that. You cannot objectify it. It comes out of this very process that design cannot escape from. So it's not like um, there's it's something outside or it's just some future thing or some action or something that you're going to be subject to. It's you can't escape from anxiety. It's part of who you are. You know what I mean? So that's what he's trying to do there. And so he brings in, see, this is what replaces Descartes' concept of self-consciousness. This is what blows that away for the first time. And gets beyond the subjectivism of Descartes. He's giving you an example. Here's how it. Yeah, that's the way I see it. I don't know if that answers your question,
So
but
no, that's great. So is everything energia then, basically, at the end of the day?
is everything what?
Energia, energia.
Well, energeia is like a um, it's 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 something that that yeah, energeia is a manifested form of being, and
Yeah.
it means the same as entelechyia. There's no there. Aristotle uses them interchangeably, and
So
it's
okay.
um, as opposed to the potentia, which is always there as well, but you don't see it. And I think there's a way in which Heidegger sort of uses projection and thrownness in a way that's uncannily, sort of reminds one of energeia and potentia. But
Yeah, because it seems like it would make sense if everything is being in time or as time, then it would be energia all the way through a bit, right? I mean, that's how we experience time is in energia, and
well, energeia is yeah. Energeia would be the present, but not but that's not the way
but
you
present
apply
as
it
future or
to
present as
nature
past.
or
Yeah.
to things of physis. But that's the way Heidegger applies it to the being that is the self. That what is the self? It's the being that wants to know its own being. It's so like a that's that's what Dasein is, and
Yeah.
it's in the world, and that was not uh, Descartes' self was not being in the world anything like it. It was like some other world. Like how do you get to the world?
Yeah, that his in that sense, it would just be present, how he says here, it's present at hand, basically, right? If we're thinking of Descartes' idea of self-consciousness, it would just be pure present as hand versus readiness to hand, which is like experiencing time as the present as in the future also, or as in the past. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but
Yeah, I can't follow that, but
We can look at what's going on in 107 because it's sort of an instant stretch, right? He's talking about Heidegger, and in the example of dread or hope, he's responding to what might be a purely epistemological account. Dread is just sort of, a belief about something in the future that might go poorly, and you have a fear that's triggered as a result of that belief. And hope would be the other side, something good. You believe something good might happen, and so you have and he says that misses the way these are like existential characteristics of who we are, right? As that's why he says it's ontological rather than just epistemological. It says something about us as Dasein. And he has this sort of, I think it's, you saw it exactly. he criticizes Husserl for missing the thing itself. Husserl, the champion of the thing itself, missed the thing itself. And the thing itself is the ways in which this is um, part of the way we exist in the world, as opposed to just the way we sort of think about the world. And then he says Heidegger understood that, and Heidegger understood that the Greeks understood that. Right? The Greeks understood that um, that it was something about us, not just something about the way we think, not just about consciousness, but about existence. He said, and he's already laid this out as being connected to time, right? Being futural in various ways. He said, however, Aristotle wasn't able to think about the time except in terms of the present, right? This is a criticism of the Greek account of time. And so he wasn't quite able to make sense of the ways in which we are beings ahead of ourselves. And argeia as what potentiality is not how it's usually translated, right? Has this futural opening up built into it. So the extent energeia characterizes our being, it shows the way in which we are futural in our being, ontologically futural. Um, what is weird about this argument is that he's going back to an Aristotelian word, right? A word that Aristotle invented. He made up this word, didn't have a history for Aristotle, to suggest that it goes beyond what Aristotle himself understood about being, which was being as presence. So maybe he sees in Aristotle the possibility of going beyond. Does that make sense? Is there a map out of how I think his argument's unfolding?
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
that was
yeah,
that
I
was
mean,
great.
Gadamer is explaining Heidegger here. He's not saying this is my view. He's saying this is what Heidegger does.
I see.
And Heidegger reads this. Uh, he decides to correct the Greek understanding
I see.
himself, which is, which so he takes his discovery of the self and Dasein and says, well, the Greeks didn't quite get it, but let me show you what. So I mean, this isn't. And see, there's another place where Gadamer gives a hint of this because when he says the dogmatic application, so
Mhm.
Gadamer doesn't totally accept Heidegger's reading of the Greeks. He says he opened it up a lot, but he's explaining Heidegger here just like he did Husserl,
Got
and
it.
how it's the steps, like the progress, the sort of the like just the way like Aristotle, made some criticisms and improvements and found some questions that Plato hadn't answered, so on. That's what philosophy does. That's philosophy itself, as he says in the end.
Yeah. All right, Eric, sorry you've been very patient here waiting.
Oh, it's cool. This is awesome. I'm loving it. Uh, that was great. I just want to go back to John, like two talks ago, two question answers ago, because why are people so mean to Descartes? Like, I mean, look, I get that he contributed to the kind of speciesisms and all this stuff, but I don't think that Descartes is a Cartesian. If Cartesianism becomes just like Aristotle accused Plato of the third man argument so that Aristotle could create a niche for himself. Like, isn't that what happened to Descartes too? Where this kind of this what is it? Is it anachronistic to call Descartes a Cartesian in the sense that like created the tradition of Cartesianism? Because how am I trying to get at this? Like
No, I understand. Yeah,
like
that's a point.
go ahead.
Sure. I mean, yeah, we do that, but I mean, there's a sense in which he created, he crossed the line. Like
Yeah,
he
open the door just like Husserl opened the door for Heidegger.
yeah, like
Descartes
he
door
he
for
says, there's res extensa and res cogitan. Like
yeah.
he put a split. He created, like before that, being and thought were the same. There was a unity until Descartes came up and split them apart.
I mean, he basically plagiarizes Al-Ghazali and Augustine. Like, aren't
Okay. We don't need to get into that
but
debate. But yeah.
what I'm trying to get at is this idea of Husserl missing the thing itself because Husserl is too Cartesian in the present at hand notion of phenomena.
No,
That
well, I would say it. he justifies, Gadamer explains it here, how you Husserl goes back and grounds his stuff within a Kantian transcendental
Exactly
you know
where I'm going. So this idea of so what I want to accuse Heidegger and Gadamer of doing in saying Husserl missed the things themselves is that they're just changing the topic. Had Husserl heard them, why wouldn't Husserl go, yeah, that's great that you're doing that, but that's just a different topic. Yeah, that's another. Why is it I missed the thing itself instead of
where does he say that Husserl missed the thing in itself? Show me, let's look at that passage.
I'm not sure he says that. Husserl does say about Heidegger that he's doing anthropology, not phenomenology, which is part of your response, Eric.
I meant I was taking notes on what we were
Oh,
saying
I
in our
see.
discussion, and so someone said
Yeah.
he missed the things in them that
I
Husserl.
didn't say that.
No, I said that in the quote where on 107,
Yeah.
where where Gadamer says, "Is it not precisely the thing itself which has been missed here?"
Yes.
Yes. So
That's what I'm trying to get
yeah,
at.
yeah.
And so this idea
Oh,
of
right.
transcendentalism in Husserl gets construed as transcendentism because I understand transcendental to be a condition of the possibility for something, not something that is beyond lived experience, the life world, stuff like this.
Well, that's precisely what Husserl does.
Yeah,
No, he's the transcendental thinker in the manner
right. Not
of
a.
Kant, and he writes a book called Cartesian Meditations.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you read it? Yeah, it's basically very much influenced by Kant, oh yeah, no, it's and he is in he still hasn't broken loose. It was only Heidegger. That's the big thing about Heidegger. That's his historical importance. He finally overcame Descartes, and that split that we're still struggling to overcome today, which is causing us to be, which is causing us to think that we control all nature. That's directly connected. Gadamer points that out throughout his career,
I
and
think
it's wrong. It's false.
I think we could say we all could agree that there's three things in Descartes that Gadamer is opposed to, and one is the focus on methodology. Descartes very much focused on getting a method. And along with that is the elevation of scientific knowledge as the paradigm of knowledge. And then the third thing is reflective self-certainty as the ultimate means to any sort of knowledge. Right? And all three of those things he thinks you can find in Husserl. Focus on a
Yeah,
method,
and you can add
focus on
the
scientific
method.
understanding. Yeah.
The methods for direction of the mind, and um, you can also add what was I going to say? The unshakable foundation,
Mm-hmm.
and Heidegger called it the
Apodictic.
fundamentum inconcussum.
Yeah.
Now that is nowhere in Descartes. Nowhere does Descartes say fundamentum inconcussum. That's a Heideggerians don't understand that. That's a Heideggerian gloss on the historical consequence of Descartes. And Gadamer agrees with that phrase entirely. That's a correct way. And so an unshakable foundation means a new beginning. Everything pretty much, even though Descartes thought he was doing metaphysics, everything else is wiped out. And that was the effect of it. And so that's key to understanding Heidegger and Gadamer and Husserl.
That's a critique of Husserl's goal for ultimate foundation. Is that what you're...
Kind of apodictic certainty. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, the apodictic certainty of self-consciousness. In other words, I know, like, there's one thing I can't doubt, and that's what's in my mind. That's what Locke and Hume and all those guys believe. And then and Berkeley, but it's not, and then Nietzsche comes along and says, no, you don't really know that at all, and so on, and Freud and all this stuff, and Gadamer, that's just wrong anyway. But you're still a Cartesian because you're still Anyway, yeah.
If Gadamer doesn't believe in an ultimate foundation, then where does he see the conversation ending, I guess, or where does it amount to? Because the only thing I could come up with to juxtapose against the goal of an ultimate foundation is the being with the other as the kind of extent for a replacement of
Well, you
foundationalism.
gotta read Greek philosophy, like I always say. Like, do you know the word for foundation in or ground in Aristotle? Anybody?
Quit.
Nope.
You would say arche, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Well, in Aristotle, you discover that's a word for principle. You discover that at the end of your investigation. You begin with language, which is Gadamer. You begin with how do people talk about it? What is said? What is, and you pull it out of that. And it's totally Gadamer. And he's trying to say Heidegger kind of got to that, but he didn't hang on to it. And he went, sideways into poetry and art and all this stuff.
So to flesh out the arcane then requires dialogue to even get to that point. So that makes sense with his foundation in dialogue.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And it's this ontology of linguisticality. Absolutely. Yeah. You guys all know that. That's in
Greg,
Truth and Method, sure.
thank you, Greg. Thanks for your patience.
David, I think to some extent you anticipated what I was going to say, which is just when we're talking about accusations that someone is a Cartesian or someone is a Kantian or someone is a metaphysician, it's helpful to keep in mind like that all those things are said in many ways, right? Like Descartes thought lots of things, and accusing someone of being a Cartesian is clearly saying that they agreed with Descartes about something. But like we have to ask ourselves in each given context, well, which thing is it? Like, what is it that makes someone a Cartesian in this situation? My own take on what Gadamer's talking about here, and the sense in which Husserl is a Cartesian, has to do with this idea that the conditions that make something what it is, or that make an idea mean what it does, make an idea represent what it does, that those conditions are all located in consciousness. They are all at least potentially present to consciousness, so that I can, if I reflect hard enough and clear my mind away of enough prejudices or whatever, I can make all of the conditions that make my thinking possible present to myself. I can know them. And that's what ties it in then to the Kantian project, because that's precisely what Kant is trying to do too, right? Is say, look, our thinking is always conditioned by this stuff that we haven't noticed. Here, let me tell you about it. It's the forms of intuition, it's the categories, and so on and so forth. And look, now that we have made all of these conditions present, now we have genuine knowledge. Now that the meaning of our terms and things is secure. And I take it that the Heideggerian and Gadamerian point is that you can't do that because not all the conditions of meaningfulness are in our heads. Not all of them are located in consciousness. Some of them are out there in the world. And it's by being out there in the world that these things mean what they do, but we can never kind of recover all of it. It's always happening behind our back. And that's the sense in which Descartes, and really everybody after Descartes, Kant and Hegel and all these thinkers and Husserl are still Cartesians. Even though obviously Husserl disagrees with, like, Husserl's not a substance dualist, for example. I don't think he would separate, res extensa from res cogitans in the way that Descartes does. But he does, I think, share with Descartes and with the whole kind of modern tradition that fundamental assumption that it's at least possible for us to make explicit to ourselves everything that is conditioning and making our thought possible.
Yeah, and you're saying that self-consciousness is the ground of all truth. Yeah.
That's right.
that's
Yeah, I find it
that's
helpful
what,
to think of it in semantic terms, in terms of like what makes things meaningful, what makes things mean what they do, have the significance that they do. But it's connected to truth and knowledge and all that other stuff too.
yeah, and this is basically what is meant by the Cartesian or subjectivism or whatever. It's all this means the same thing. Doesn't matter. But um, yeah, no, no, and Hegel was the closest to, because he tried to bring in history to say it's all laid out historically, and then we can get transparency that way. But I mean, Gadamer, when Gadamer's he's talking about how do you, his question is how do you read a philosoph and understand a philosophical text? That's really what he wants to come down to, especially a Greek text. The thing is, he says there is the text. If you want to understand exactly what that text says, you're trying to understand something that doesn't exist. There is no, there is no meaning in itself. This is part of this is part of this is where philosophy becomes hermeneutics, and hermeneutics becomes philosophy. Just as like there's no ground or bottom, there is no per se, there's no thing in itself as such. Like um, there's no absolute, whatever. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
But how is that any more not dogmatic than Husserl? Isn't that just
Pardon?
dogmatism?
I don't know that Husserl is dogmatic on this story.
Uh, the dogmatism, where does he say it? On page 107, right? The dogmatism of describing things in themselves, right?
The
So,
dogmatic traits of the notion of consciousness itself, he talked about.
right. And so going back to John Beach saying there is no meaning in itself. There is only the meaning that occurs through the actual dialogue. I'm assuming that's analogous to there is no things in themselves. There's only the things in themselves as they are brought to being through our
Your dialectic.
yeah. So isn't asserting things in themselves equal, isn't denying transcendent things in themselves just as dogmatic as asserting there are no things in themselves?
Well, I mean, for science, there is like science is trial and errors, but I mean, this thing here um, uh, uh, about consciousness, and he says there's no consciousness or self-consciousness in Aristotle, no subject of subjectivity, nor is there an ego of transcendental subjectivity in the Greeks. And this is Gadamer saying, I'm with the Greeks. I'm not with Husserl. I'm with the Greeks. And so the if you notice in Being and Time, Heidegger never talks about Bewusstsein. Like he totally avoids the word consciousness. Like, and that's not accidental. He's not. And see, uh, Descartes fixed consciousness, and Gadamer would refine it more to self-consciousness as something that is the foundation. It's unshakable. You can't get around it. And Heidegger finally says, "Yes, you can. I got it. I got you. I got a way around it." And Gadamer is with Heidegger 100% in that. Like it is to that extent. I don't know if that's making sense to you yet, but
Let me just say, just in case it leads to confusion, the saying is to the things themselves, not to the things in themselves. Um, although Husserl is trying to understand them in their eidetic character, right? We're trying to get the essential features of the things themselves, not trying to get
Mhm.
to, it wouldn't make sense on a Kantian thing to say we're describing the thing in itself because that doesn't have any sort of phenomenal character to it. Greg, you've been waiting. You want to get in here?
Oh, I was just going to say to the point about dogmatism, when he says this notion is dogmatic here, I don't think he's saying that Husserl's dogmatic in the sense that he just like asserts this and then like plugs his ears and blah, 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 I won't listen to anybody else. Dogmatic here, I think, just means it relies on some assumptions that haven't been questioned. That Husserl's operating with an assumption about what consciousness is like and how it works that he hasn't questioned. And it turns out, in Gadamer's view, that assumption's mistaken, and so that mistaken assumption then kind of colors everything that Husserl says. That I think that's the sense in which he's he's quote unquote dogmatic here.
And is which pages does he talk? Does he use the word dogmatism?
107.
107. Yeah, he also uses it on 108. Um, and I think he's referring to Heidegger actually. When Heidegger applies his notion of the temporal concept of the self to the Greeks, or tries to interpret them, I think that's it's a Heidegger's dogmatism. But
Let me mention one more thing about Husserl I think is relevant, and this is actually a transition to a question, a topic that Eric brought up. And that for Husserl, it's not enough simply to have a kind of pure perception. Uh, Phenomenology is a collective philosophical practice. You have to describe it, try to find the words to capture your perception, share that with others, encourage them to pay as close attention as possible as they can, and then see whether your words are doing the kind of work you're hoping they're doing. And that's really the only point at which knowledge starts to arise is through this collective struggling together to try to find the right words to capture our perceptions. And I think, as Greg, you were saying, all the conditions of meaning are not in our heads. Gadamer and Heidegger, especially Gadamer, is going to say that activity of putting things into words for the sake of others, so that they can then process it and find other ways of articulating it, and we were doing that together. That is not what happens after we've grasped the meaning. That is constitutive of the meaning. That is the way we're getting outside of our heads into these world of meanings in the world of language and actually making possible meaning rather than just sort of reporting it after you grab. Does that sound right to you, Greg?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's
Okay.
right. Dialogue is the means by which we kind of avail ourselves of and connect ourselves up to those conditions of meaning that lie outside our heads. Because
Okay.
dialogue always happens with particular people, with particular backgrounds, in particular settings and situations, and all that stuff comes into play there and allows meaning to get fleshed out and happen.
Yeah, exactly. You could say about a poet that they are really good at capturing something in ways that no one thought to capture it before. Right? It's like, wow, yeah, that's just sort of eye-opening the way you presented that in your poetic language, right? And I'm thinking back to the original question Eric asked about the contrast between Heidegger's focus on poetic language and Gadamer's focus on dialogue. And the thought is then that maybe Heidegger's focus on poetic language still has this idea of the individual who is able to see clearly and is able to put things into words in ways that other people have not yet realized yet. There's a certain sort of epistemic authority then. It's maybe not the Husserlian person who's done all the bracketing and all the attentiveness and has found the right words, but now it's the poet who's done that we then need to learn from, which is a different model than Gadamer's dialogue. Does that
well,
seem fair?
I would
Yeah,
say that Heidegger gave up on philosophy, and that's what Gadamer is saying. Fine, he's believes in truth and poetry, but he does not want to give up on philosophy. But I just like to take us back to
okay.
one thing, and that was in being or in um, uh, um, uh, Truth and Method. Gadamer says that with Heidegger, grounding underwent a complete reversal
Sure.
of meaning. And this is what we're referring to with this is with Aristotle. This is Heidegger got that from Aristotle when arche comes at the end of an investigation.
Mm-hmm.
But the preach both Eric, both of my grandfathers were preachers.
Okay.
You gotta give me a break here.
Okay. Preach the word.
Yeah.
Let's look at the bottom of 108. That's where Gadamer really takes this topic up in respect to Heidegger, where he says, after talking about Husserl, talking about Heidegger, he now says, I have made my own contribution to philosophy by linking up with this vision of the later Heidegger. To be sure, I did not follow him in his incessant and repeatedly frustrated effort to bypass, I would say frustrated and frustrating, effort to bypass the language of traditional metaphysics in its conceptual system and his talk about eidetic knowledge, and to explain the evocative force of the poetic word for philosophic thought. To me, this seems neither necessary nor possible. The poetic word is, after all, the absolutely novel word, the as of yet unspoken word. It is like a new birth of language, so that it is inappropriate to talk of the metaphor as a means of poetry. In truth, metaphor is a means of rhetoric. And I suppose the idea there is that metaphor always plays on things we're familiar with already in new ways, and so it's not absolutely novel. However, for philosophy too, language is never the old, the obsolete, the already worn out language. And insofar as the latter is the case, language is in need of destruction, of the uncovering of the original experience of Dasein, which would be a phenomenological project. Language never says what has already been said, as long as it's working rather than celebrating. It is always anew. It is always and anew, comma, there should be a comma there, reply. Right? So that's where Gadamer says, this is my addition to the story. This is where I come in with this focus on language always being reply. What do people think about that?
I like where it says at the very end, as long as it is working rather than celebrating. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
celebrating would be like the epistemological, like let's systematize and figure out what we know rather than just doing the working of engaging and participating with the text.
What's the German word that's being translated as celebrating?
I just thought to look that same thing up here. In here. Destruction.
I'm having a hard time finding the paragraph.
In the German, it's on page 106.
I think it's fired, isn't it? Which is literal, of which celebrating is the literal translation.
Yeah, to celebrate.
Are there any other connotations to it, though?
I would say not in my view. I would say like celebrating is a quite straightforward, uncontroversial translation of fire.
Yeah.
I think then I mean maybe there are connotations, but I'm not initially aware of that at least.
But what's an example where words are being used solely for celebration, right? Like happy birthday.
I found it. It's actually in scare quotes in the German. Yeah.
Because I'm not used to hearing like, oh, those are celebratory words. I've never heard that phrase before. In English, anyway.
The idea is right, not that the word is celebrating, but the word is being celebrated. I think I read this as is that right, or am I reading this wrong? When
No,
words are working and not.
it's actually where it's language.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost the paragraph
In the
now.
German or the English? In
In the
English,
English.
English is on 109. It's the top of the page 109. It's the last sentences of the paragraph. In German, it's on 106. Wenn Sprache als Vollzug des Da nicht feiert,
Oh, yeah.
arbeitet. Sagst du immer schon Gesagtes.
Like language as working, doing its job, versus language not doing its job when it is celebrating rather than working. And I'm going, all right, what's celebrative language? Like, good job.
I I took this to be like close to when he talks about ritual uses of language, where language is, yeah, like it might be spoken in a festival, but it isn't creating meaning. It's just that's what I took as sort of language celebrating instead of working.
That makes sense, Karen.
Yeah.
So
that's where I was going too. That's perfect. I wasn't quite to the festive ritual kind of thing. I was thinking more like slogans, propaganda, right? Like, because I have been trying to argue with MAGAs on like Fox News and stuff. I'm just like, I have a lot of free time. I'm bored, and I just want to I want to advocate for justice in these things, but I keep getting the exact same script. It's oh, and then I looked at Bonhoeffer talking about like ignorance and stupidity, that the way in which words work for these sorts of thinking is that it's just a script, because every time I challenge someone, they're like, oh, you drink the Biden sauce. And I'm like, I'm not pro genocide Joe. So I don't know why you keep coming back. So this idea that language is being celebratory in this, like Karen, you pointed out, the kind of ritual sense, or what I'm trying to say with this, like script or sloganing, that seems to be the opposite of language.
Hey, Frida, what do you make of, have you looking at the German?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Yeah, what do you make of that phrase, wenn Sprache als Vollzug des Da nicht feiert?
Yeah, as you mentioned, he's using scare quotes in the German, so that might indicate that he's quoting someone, maybe Heidegger. I mean, that's not a reliable source, but I've just asked AI about the like where feiern in relation to language appears in Heidegger, and it points me to Heidegger's essay poetically man dwells, and apparently Heidegger said, but I didn't find it so far, so I'm not sure
Okay.
100% sure whether it's right, but where Heidegger says language is the celebration of being. So if that is correct, it might be a quotation of Heidegger, and if AI is misleading me, then it's just forget about that. But yeah, the fact that he's using scare quotes in the German might indicate.
Awesome.
One thought I had, what's the term Wittgenstein uses for language going on holiday? Because that notion would at least make sense in the context here.
I don't know that term.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, Greg. He says that every time when we forget like words being used in specific games, we want to take them outside the context of the
Yeah.
game. And that's language going on a holiday.
Which is why it would make sense here, as this is the language isn't working, instead it's doing this other thing, and when it does that, it's not saying anything new. I doubt that's actually what he's quoting here, but I don't know what Wittgenstein uses in the German for that. It's just a thought that occurred to me.
Well, yeah, or it could be referring to J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words too. And there's a bunch of other uses for words that, but Gadamer's talking about, it's the same thing, I think, in poetry and in philosophy. You search for the word, you draw the word out, the word comes into being, and in a sense, and that's what Aristotle did and Plato did, except they talked about, there wasn't such a thing as metaphysics, or these concepts, and they just took them from colloquial speech and made them, but they said they could find what needed to be said, and they just drew it from the language, not from experience, but from the way you speak about something. And Aristotle would give examples of that. That's where all his principles came from too.
I still want to look at the German a little more. I put it down in the chat. And I'll get to you in a second. I know we have people lined up here. Because it begins with wenn Sprache als Vollzug des, so when language as the realization of the there, of the da, the here, that isn't quite captured in the English. As long as it's the full or the completion, the realization, as long as it's not just celebrating, but it's at work, then it doesn't say all there is to say. So when language really brings something, I think it's saying when language really brings something forward, and language is really working, it always does it in a way that shows there's more to be said. And language that celebrates it doesn't present as something sort of living and full of inquiry, but just simply that is something that's sort of frozen in time. I'm just trying to figure out what to make sense of that first part of the phrase.
Oh, love that. I love how you're taking it.
Well, I'm maybe just making stuff up here. Frito, you're a native speaker. What do you take for that
I
phrase?
mean, maybe it's just also not a quotation, but just the contrast between like some contrast between celebrating and working that Gadamer establishes in a metaphorical sense. So if language merely celebrates, it is kind of dwelling in or like resting on previous achievements, previous success. So in this case, it might be it might happen that language says what has already been said. If it merely celebrates, if it merely kind of restates what Kant has, or someone has said for yeah, many times, but instead, and this is kind of the contrasting term to celebrating, then working means like not merely restating, but engaging in this dialogue, in the dialectic, and therefore being productive in a more demanding sense of. So maybe Gadamer doesn't quote someone and also does not rely on necessarily like very obvious connotation of this word, but kind of establishes this opposition of metaphors between like just celebrating versus working to kind of capture something like working corresponding to progress and celebrating corresponding to something like dwelling in what has been achieved previously already.
Right. Yeah, good. And then Karen pointed out that it's what he says about ritualistic use of language, where it's almost not functioning in trying to say something. It's just part of the ritual. That's good. Okay, Andrew, thank you for waiting.
Okay, thanks. This is a really interesting topic. I find it interesting, this question of celebratory language on page 108 and then 110. He makes an analogy to the sun rising. So on 108, he says, it is wording, for example, and then the sun rising, which I think is important. And then on 110, he refers to it is worlding,
Yeah.
Rather than wording.
Yep.
And also an analogy to the sun. So I'm suggesting that celebration is kind of an organic process, which also dovetails with his references to Aristotle and Energeia, importing language from physics into language. And similarly here with reference to the sun, which of course repeats every day, but is something we celebrate.
Yeah.
And in a new way every day, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's the attachment to nature that I'm tagging on to here, the analogy to a natural process.
I thought but just sunsets aren't a natural process.
An organic process, an organic unfolding, if you like, or emergence, like Energeia.
But the sun doesn't set.
Well, that's a good point. Well, of course, for us, it does. Well said. But from our position, it does, and that's important. That's very significant. Yeah.
Let me just point something about the wording to worlding. That's explicit inversion what he says about Heidegger on page 108. He says the young Heidegger talked about worlding and the mature thinker talked about wording. He says that back to back, and then later on he makes the inverse move and moves to talk about worlding at the end. Yeah, I really want to spend time in this last paragraph in this last page, Andrew. So thanks for taking us in that direction. Michael, you've been waiting.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out what other people thought of. It's actually in the same section that Andrew was talking about, and how he explains what being is. In the middle of the first paragraph on 108 to all the way to the end. And I think it might tie into what we're trying to like get at here. with the difference, but basically it caught my eye that he says being is nothing, but it's always continuously more than nothing, which makes it like a here I could just read from what it says. It's on the middle of 108 in the first paragraph. Says logos is no longer to be thought of as disclosure of what is present, nor being as some superior or minor entity that is present and present to itself. Rather, it is being not any entity at all. It is nothing. And yet, this nothingness as which being shows itself and which pertains to any entity, whatever, in particular to Dasein, knowing itself as finite historical, this nothingness is not nothing. So it seems to me that it's touching on this idea that what his goal is to get at being, and it's a self-perpetuating endless task that is connected to this idea of working versus celebrating. Maybe, I don't know what other people think, but and it at the very end of the paragraph, interestingly, he kind of referencing Heidegger says this is why his real goal wasn't creating a book about being and time, but being as time, how he ends that paragraph on 108.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always engaging in time, which is through engaging with being, this never continuous process that goes on, but and which I see as working. I don't know how other people see it, but versus celebrating that whole thing we were talking about before.
Right.
So is that common? Is that commonly how we talk about being? It's nothing, but it's always more than it's this nothingness is not nothing.
Right.
Was that what did other people think
That's
of that?
classic. That's classic Heidegger.
That's classic. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
Well,
right.
but also it's potentiality, right? Like because potential is
Yeah.
an actual. So it is this energia type
It's the ontological difference in a way.
becoming rather than just being.
That's what I
But
thought. Yeah. That's
yeah,
what's.
but going back to wording, um, Gadamer never spoke with notes, even when he spoke in foreign languages, because he wanted, and it goes back to the Phaedrus too, like uh, where they say if you have a great speech and if you give the speech and it's written out and you read it, but then if you can't repeat it in a better way, then you're not a philosopher. In other words, you have to be working with words all the time, even though you can't, everything's already been spoken, like you're working with what's already been spoken, but that's just in the environment. That's just in your understanding of what is. And because the way you speak about it naturally, but you find new ways to express it. And that's what finding the right words are. And that's what philosophy is all about. That's what dialectic is all about. Is getting that new. It's always that's why it's always working. And energeia means at work. Yeah, precisely, literally, in the Greek sense.
Yeah, working. And we
So
turn.
maybe.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead. No. Go. You're good. I was just gonna say that maybe the celebrating connects to the last talk we had about systematicity, because in order to celebrate, maybe it's like, oh, how can we connect all these things into one system? I don't know.
I think you're reading it. My sense is it's narrower than that. It's
Mm.
like using words, but not really in a way that they're alive.
Uh,
Like I'm just quoting somebody or using it ritualistically. It's like I'm not even thinking about really what they mean.
yeah.
Okay.
I'm just sort of presenting them. They don't have a kind of a life to them that the meaning is alive in them, and then we can take them in different directions. They're just kind of dead sounds. I
And
think,
it could also have a derogatory meaning of celebrating your own dogmatism,
I suppose.
It
Yep,
could mean a lot of things.
self-celebration. I want to look at that last paragraph in the last page when he turns to metaphysics, partially because our German has, I don't know, four or five other sentences that never got translated. And maybe it's because Greeter was working from an earlier version. We know this was, I think it was originally given in Spanish and then translated into German and has a couple drafts. That's why I had two different years when I said 81 and 83. Um, it's a little tricky because the paragraph breaks are completely different in the German and the English. So in a German, it's on page 108. And you've got to find, um, you have the triad. That's easy to find in the German. That's 4 lines down. The triad Kunst, religion, philosophy. So that is an ancient triad, and science is destroying them, and metaphysics, it seems, is on the way out as well. But then the transition is at the end of that paragraph. As long as we question in this manner, as long as we question at all, everything remains open, also as regards the possibility of metaphysics. And so, and of course, that was something that Heidegger wanted to announce the end of. So here it seems like Gadamer is speculating about perhaps metaphysics has a place after all. Oh yeah, and that phrase "Selbst die Möglichkeit der Metaphysik" it's its own sentence. Also, the end of art. Just as long as we're asking, we ask above all. Everything's on the table. Everything is still open, even the possibility of metaphysics.
I love that.
And then he says, perhaps metaphysics is so. This is, I think, a little better in German. Perhaps metaphysics is not only, and then he says, and in Aristotle, it wasn't only ontotheology, seeking to establish what being is by considering the supreme entity. So maybe that characterization of metaphysics is not the right one, and that wasn't even Aristotle's, he's saying. Um, Maybe metaphysics signifies an opening into a dimension. I'm trying to keep checking the German. Um, and self, it's dimension. It's the same word. Um, which endless as time itself and flowing presence as time itself embraces all our questions, our saying and hoping. I know, Eric, I'm sure you love this stuff. You're into all because you've got all this theology back. But Greg, can you talk us down here from this grand metaphysical way of speaking?
No, all I was going to say is that there's a what I take to be a kind of parallel passage to this, and it's in philosophical hermeneutics, and I have to move my screen around here. So in The Nature of Things and the Language of Things, that essay, pretty, I think near the end of that, well, shoot, yeah, here we go. So it's on if in philosophical hermeneutics, if you have your copy handy, it's on pages 74 and into 75. But the basic claim he's making here is that there's something that the classical metaphysical tradition had right that Kant importantly got wrong, and that's that metaphysics saw this pre-existing correspondence between thought and being. And Kant loses that. That's how we get the Ding an sich. But no, the metaphysicians had it right. He says, now the metaphysicians grounded it theologically, so you get that kind of ontotheological point here. And then he says, so quoting now philosophy certainly can no longer avail itself of such a theological grounding, and will also not want to repeat the secularized versions of it represented by speculative idealism, blah, 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 blah. But for its part, philosophy may also not close its eyes to the truth of this correspondence. In this sense, the task of metaphysics continues, though certainly is a task that cannot again be solved as metaphysics, that is, by going back to an infinite intellect. Mm-hmm. So what he seems to be saying here, and it seems to me that it echoes what he's saying in the last paragraph of our reading, is that the kind of questioning that metaphysics is engaged in, the kind of project there of trying to find some kind of ultimate and holistic some understanding of our lives as a whole, and not just like this or that piece of it, is absolutely a good thing to do, and a thing that we can't stop doing. It's just that where we've gotten to now is that we can no longer do that by trying to kind of ground that ultimateness in the idea of a thought thinking itself, or some kind of intellect where everything's purely present to it. And then what he goes on later to say in philosophical hermeneutics is that rather than grounding the correspondence of being and thinking in God, my idea is that it's grounded in language, that language is what brings these things together. So anyway, I don't know if that passage is any less obscure or clearer than the one we're dealing with.
No, that's awesome.
It just struck me that it's maybe potentially trying to say the same thing in a slightly different way.
So endless as time itself, a dimension which is endless as time itself.
Yeah, and
Only
I would like
presence
to
is time.
suggest
Go
that
ahead.
we've just been doing metaphysics for the last hour and a half, basically, and that the metaphysics, what was originally it was a bunch of books that were an extension of questions that were raised and the problems that came out of the physics, but there's no real difference. The subject matter was still the same. It was still being and so on, but it got a little more refined. And I think and for like both, I mean, Heidegger is like, he's very much a metaphysician, and he doesn't say, he says it's not something we can overcome or throw away or get rid of. And Gadamer keeps trying to remind us of that. And Gadamer has never been said anything against metaphysics, doesn't think it makes any sense. And the it's like the problem is with epistemology, as according to Gadamer, it reduces everything to science. Like it says, science is the ground of all truth. Like we have to approach it like, how do we know? How do we justify? This goes right back to Descartes. And they would say like epistemology begins with, there's no epistemology in Greek philosophy, in Greek thought whatsoever, according to Gadamer and Heidegger, really. But and Heidegger calls epistemology metaphysics that has lost its way in the modern world. Like instead of metaphysics, that we acknowledge, we just do, we reduce everything to epistemology, but that's the influence of science and Descartes and Kant and so on. And so I think that he says like phenomenology, hermeneutics, and metaphysics are not three different philosophical points of view. He says, he's saying, but they are, all three of these are philosophy in itself, or they all belong to philosophy.
Okay, so far so good. We can make this fit into Gadamer's thing, but we're just starting here. He says, to put it in the Aristotelian way, Aristotle denoted the supreme entity as that which is always present to itself. Fair enough. And he characterizes divine being in terms of man's highest possibilities, as energeia, actus purus, as wakefulness, as the scene and contemplation of what is. Okay, this is an aspect of being that certainly has its truth. Being is presence, and all presencing consciousness means being. I'll pause there. Are we okay with that?
That's Gadamer, and maybe in Heidegger and Aristotle, not so much Heidegger.
Not so much Heidegger.
And at least in my current intuition of it.
So in Aristotle's Metaphysics, when he says, it would be absurd for gods to think about some things, or absurd for God to think about some things that humans get caught up in. But ideally, we want to think true things just like the God does. But our problem is that we get fatigued. And so,
well, the Greeks would say the gods don't do philosophy.
Well, I'm talking about in Aristotle's Metaphysics, when he gets to the prime mover, he literally says this God. I mean, in the translation, it says God.
But it's not, but it's not a transcendent
I get
concept of the
that it's not
divinity is
Zeus.
Christian.
I get that it's not Zeus. All I'm trying to say is the prime thinker, right? The active intelligence that Ibn goes with. That our aspiration is toward that, like being awake is to be thinking true thoughts along these lines of the ultimate thinker, but that we get tired, we get fatigued. That's why we can't think truth all the time.
No, I think that that's getting close. But what I'd say is that the Plato was very like soto notice, like know thyself. Like Gadamer says, that means know that you are not a god. You never have knowledge. You only know, we're only finite, and Aristotle wouldn't deny that. And it's not because we get tired. It's just because it's not. That's not for us to know. We can know truth. We can philosophize, and we can get insights that can, like with Parmenides, that are sort of put in the mouths of goddess or something. But it's still, in a way, it was just basically adding another limitation to what we can know,
So
and giving more unity to what we know, the Parmenides. But which both Plato and Aristotle follow Parmenides entirely. But the I think that it's more of a, like they knew the finitude, the limitations of knowledge, maybe a bit more than I can think Aristotle knew it a bit more than that might be implied in how we could take the prime mover as a thing, as a existing sort of entity or a being or something. I think it's more noetic. It's more sort of eidetic than that.
Eric?
So I hear you about the absolute difference, right? Like humans are not capable of divine knowledge. That Gadamer says something along these lines. I recall, right? Like we are not. He's quoting Kierkegaard. In the face of God, we are always in the wrong. Something like this. But here's what Aristotle says in the Metaphysics. This is 1074b15.
Okay, just hang on a sec if you would.
Yeah.
All right.
So 1074b15. And I'm just going to start reading, John. I know you're getting it, but
I'm just going to get the lobes thing because it's important to know the Greek too.
Yeah.
Eric.
So
174? No, 1074.
1074b15.
Yeah. What does it say, Eric?
So I mean, there's a lot that I'm going to try to sum it up. There's like 3 paragraphs that are all relevant here because I'm trying to challenge the idea of the absolute difference that's Kierkegaardian with the temporal difference that is what I'm hearing Aristotle say. And so, yes, we can't. So this, I'm trying to focus on the fatigue because I'm trying to get at Kierkegaard is bringing in a kind of problematic ontotheology that undermines our capacity, right? Like, so we've got Maimonides doing absolute negative theology, right? Like God is so beyond what we can think and talk about that we can never say anything positive about God. Well, you just said something positive about God. It just included a negative anyway. So the nature of divine understanding raises a number of puzzles. For understanding seems to be the most divine things we can do, but many difficulties arise about the state it must be in if it is to be so divine. If it understands nothing, what is impressive about it? It would be like someone asleep. If, on the other hand, it does understand, but something else controls whether it understands in its essence, whatever, it is not the best substance. But Aristotle is saying understanding is the best substance. And in any case, whether its essence is potential or actual understanding, what does it understand? It must understand either itself or something else. If something else, then either always the same thing or else different things at different times. Then does it make any difference whether the object of its understanding is fine or is just any old thing? Surely there are some things that it would be absurd for the divine to think about.
Right.
It understands what is most divine and most valuable, and it does not change. So truth, right? And it would be thereby also be emotion.
Mm-hmm.
That's so fucked up. First, then, it is. So this is the last thing where I'm okay. First, then, if it is potential, not actual understanding, it is reasonable to expect that it continues the exercise of understanding would be tiring for it. So it's got to be always actual, explicit understanding that is the truth, right? Whereas we get tired.
Yeah.
And that tiredness is what separates us from the divine, not this absolute incapacity to know the truth that seems to be ontotheological in the problematic sense of the word.
This sounds like when Gadamer talks about the Phaedrus with the fatigue you're talking about, like with the myth of the we follow the gods' chariots as high as we go, but we only get a glimpse, right? We don't get the full, and then we have to, our wings fail us and we fall down to earth. That kind of sounds like the fatigue
It's a glimpse of the actual truth, not a distortion of the actual truth.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's something that all the top philologists agreed with, like from Wilamowitz to Jaeger to Gadamer and even Heidegger, is that the Greeks did not speak about God. They never used it. They spoke about the gods or the divine. And it's always a predicate. The divine, it's always a predicate. So
right. Christians and others ruin the word God by thinking that it's not a predicate when it still remains a predicate. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go back to Gadamer, because the next sentence strikes me as really interesting, and then I'll get Greg in here. The next sentence he says, actually, he's talking about this is a legitimate aspect of being, this sort of presence. This is the way in Aristotle it would have been present as supreme entity. He says the objectivity of science is the purest fulfillment of this experience of being. So this is a legitimate aspect of being, and science is the purest and most abstract fulfillment of it. So science is the thing that can capture being in its most pure and abstract level. It just, however, there is more to being than being at this than this aspect of being that you find in pure presence. So here he's giving science credit for grasping being as presence, but he's saying there's more to being than this level of presence. That's a surprising thing for Gadamer to say. Greg, you can get in here now. I just wanted to keep going through this.
No, I think that's really, I think that's good. Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I see him saying in this paragraph as a whole, right? So he's just gotten done saying, right, I don't want to follow Heidegger in this attempt to, like, just completely rid ourselves of the language of metaphysics, because number one, we can't, and number two, we don't need to. But I take what he's trying to do here is, just like he just said, how when language is at work, new dimensions of meaning, new possibilities can open up. He's trying to do that to the word metaphysics here. And what he's trying to say is, okay, what is metaphysics all about? Like, what is kind of the fundamental task metaphysics is trying to accomplish? And it seems like what he's saying here is that it's not simply, like Heidegger and lots of other people have thought, the attempt to kind of trace everything back to an ultimate being, to trace what we do in kind of like limited and imperfect and impure ways back to something that would do those things in an unlimited and infinite and perfect way. That's certainly lots of metaphysicians have done that, but that's not the whole story, or I think Gadamer is suggesting here even the most fundamental one. The task of metaphysics is the attempt to be awake, right? To know ourselves, to attend to what is going on around us, to who we are, to what we are, to how it is that our lives have purpose and meaning. That's the core of what metaphysics was trying to do. Now they took a wrong turn in trying to think that project can be completely fulfilled but in ontotheological terms. Or I think another way to put that, they made a mistake in thinking that what we're doing when we are wakeful
Mm-hmm.
is a kind of like anticipation of, or maybe like shadow of what God is doing when God is perfectly awake to everything all at once. That's not the right way to understand what wakefulness is. It's not, our wakefulness is not like an imperfect version of some absolute wakefulness. But the idea that we should pursue wakefulness is absolutely right, and that kind of just is the project of philosophy as a whole, and hermeneutics is trying to do that as well. Does that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that especially makes sense of what he talks about next, the awakening of the worlding.
Sure. And I wouldn't even add that as well. I would say that is hermeneutics. And and but it's so, the prejudice of a transcendental God is so deep within us, um, from that is so difficult. Gadamer has written two really good papers on this. Religion and religiosity, and Socrates, and the concept of the divine in early Greek thought, or whatever, in one of the Yale collections. And it's there. And when he gave us the lecture, or the course on early Greek philosophy and the pre-Socratics, the one that's like reprised again 14 years later in the beginning of philosophy. The first 2 hours was on the Greek understanding of the divine, because it's so different. So we just have to be so careful about, because they hadn't even defined, like, Plato and Aristotle didn't have the same understanding of what being was, quite different. But I mean, they're still trying to define, like, I mean, they still, and Aristotle and the people in the Peripatetics, they still worship, they still did the rituals, they still honored the gods. Like, it is such, and even Plato, like, is full of divine myths, and it's not a joke. Like, people think, well, Socrates is talking about the gods, he's being humorous. No, he's not. Like, it's so difficult. So it's danger. We're on dangerous ground. Basically, I agree, Greg, with what you said, but I'm just saying, I think that's good. I think that's very insightful. But the thing is, we're on such precarious ground. And when we talk about, use the word God in Greek thought, or,
Good, thanks.
that's all
I
I
want to
want.
look at the Heraclitus quote and what in the German comes after it. I put it in the chat. There's a number of sentences that either didn't make it in the translation, or Gadamer decided had to be added at this point. And I'm curious what you think about that. But first, the quote, and it's confusing in English. To speak with Heraclitus, only he will find the fulfillment of his hopes, who is expectant of the unexpected and of that which is not to be expected, which sounds like saying the same thing two different ways in English, right? It's a little bit confusing. I don't know what I'm gonna call him Frito again. Frito, help us out here. The there's the unverhofften, what we call that, what the unexpected. But what is erhoffenden? That has a different character to it. The nicht zu erhoffenden. How does that resonate with you as being different than der des Unverhofften?
I think so. So grammatically, the difference is probably the first word unverhofft is like both are participles, but the first word unverhofft is participle to, and the second one nicht zu erhoffenden is like a present participle, and Mm, I would say the first word, like das Unverhoffte, which is also, yeah, which both are translated the same way, right? Or almost similarly. Yes, similarly. It means something like kind of the process is complete. So that which was not expected. Das ist
I
das
see.
Unverhoffte, the first of them. Das nicht zu erhoffenden. And the
Okay.
contrast is some not expect something not expected, which kind of proceeds into the present, I would say,
I
qua
see.
this qua grammatical form that is used. And so kind of it's something which is continues to be not yeah, expected.
So might you
I'm
say,
sorry, which page does he mention
oh, it's on page
Freiherrschein?
110. I put, oh, and the German?
No, no, in the English. Okay,
Page
110.
110. It's
Okay.
the very second last sentence in English translation.
Oh, okay.
His hopes, what is expected, um, what has been, what was unanticipated and is not yet anticipated, or something like this. Or there's a tense different, right? The idea that one is already taken place and one is looking forward, or still we don't know it. We didn't see that coming is one way to say something. Another is say, and we don't see it coming.
Are you talking about where it says who is
Yep,
expecting of the
Yeah,
unexpected?
yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. I put the German up there because it's in
but
English.
yet
It feels like
we're still anticipating something's coming, but we don't know what thing is coming. Right? We're to be awake is to be aware that the dialogue is incomplete, but not know what thing, what word or what thing is going to complete it yet, because the completion only comes with the fulfillment of the question and answer of successful dialogue.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe one connotation also of the second version, which is also captured well in the translation, I would say that nicht zu erhoffenden is translated as that which is not to be expected. So this is also maybe kind of denoting something of which it is excluded. It's not possible to be expected or something, or it
right,
ought not to be expected or something like that.
right. You really would not see that coming. Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks. So here are the sentences. I just ran it through. I didn't have time to do a real translation, so I ran it through Google Translate. Greg, yeah, go ahead.
You go ahead with what you were doing. I was
I
going to
was,
bring
I
up.
was just going to say I put the English up there of the missing sentences that are in German. Ours goes straight from the English goes straight from the Heraclitus quote to the last sentence. The German has this whole section here about dialogue added in, and it talks about an anticipation is also what first allows every conversation to become language. All speech directed as the other, present, absent, specific, indeterminate, whether as a question or an answer, is nevertheless aware that it has not said what it actually wanted to say. Only in those fortunate cases in which a conversation truly succeeds, where the other meets the other half and truly responds, does every attempt there's probably a better word than that, change from failure into success. This applies equally to the soul's conversation with itself, which Plato called thinking, and to every interaction with a text, be it a poem or a thought. And then he says phenomenology, hermeneutics, and metaphysics are not three different philosophical points of view.
Was that word transform that you were about to say?
Oh, yeah, the German word. I just stuck it in Google Translate. And so you always want to sort of go back and say, well, maybe,
Yeah.
what's the German word there? German word is. I'm looking for it. I should have just looked in the German on here. Every attempt to transform from failure to success. Oops.
I think it's wandelt.
It is Wandel. Yeah, it's changed.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Changes itself from. So my guess is Gadamer added that. I mean, as a translator, he went just skip a few sentences at the end there. So the thought is maybe everything that happens before it isn't dialogical enough.
I just want to say a celebratory word. This was awesome.
We're not
That's
done.
fun.
I know, but you adding that like is just like providing that which made the translation incomplete is itself bodying Gadamer's very point in what you're adding to the essay that I hadn't read in the English version.
Okay. I think I followed that. That was a complicated, grammatically complicated sentence, but I think I followed that. Well, good. I mean, it is all stuff Gadamer has said elsewhere about the function of language.
Sorry, can I bring up one thing?
Yeah, please.
So I was just thinking, John Beach, you were talking about the difference conception of divinity between Plato and Aristotle before. There's a really good article he wrote called Historicity and Truth, where he talks about that specific thing, and the way he distinguishes it is Aristotle, his idea of the divine was the unmover, like we were talking about, but for Plato, it was the neuter. He writes this long description of how Plato's idea of divinity is related to the neuter. If you've heard of him,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Like the um, all abstract concepts in Greek uh, are largely due to the fact that they do have a neuter, and you know they can have like you can have like proper nouns and concrete nouns, and then they can have like neuter accounts, and that's how they like that. No one knows where the concept of the divine came from, but it is like it's got to be it's post Homeric and pre Plato. So, but we have not, you know, it's 200 years there. We have no texts at all, nothing, except,
yeah,
you know, people quote, you know, centuries later from it. But yeah, no, uh, so
just to
it's
get
not quite, yeah,
just to give some descriptor for it, he says its power lies in how it exercises presence precisely through the fact that it cannot be localized, but it can in some way be there everywhere, which kind of speaks to how Plato think it spoke a lot to me how I read Plato when he talks about the
yes,
divine.
yeah. Well, the gods are everywhere. There's no, I mean, it's not even. I I think what's the name of that again? The name of that?
Her historicity and truth. It's in I found it in the new the Gadamer selected writings. One of the volume, I think it was volume one.
Yeah.
Um,
If you look in the acknowledgments of volume two and also volume three, which should be coming out in a week or two, you'll find my name.
no, nice, nice.
But any rate, the uh, yeah, I don't think there's. I'll read. I'll have to read that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Yeah.
We are coming near the end. This is the time where I want to make sure if there is something in here you really wanted to talk about, and now an hour and 50 minutes later, we haven't got to it. Now is your chance to bring something up, because it'd be a shame if we ended this without having something brought on the table that you really wanted to talk about from the reading. Yes, Greg.
There's not really time to talk about it. I really liked the passage on 108 where he basically points out that if we think of being purely as presence, then when we acknowledge the fact that our thinking is historically conditioned, it's gonna raise this problem of relativism. And I just found it really helpful that if we flip that, what does it do, a conversion or whatever that logical maneuver would be, that these worries about relativism, that, you know, that's like one of the big charges always brought against God. No, the whole problematic of relativism is rooted in a way of thinking about being and thinking about meaning that I'm trying to get away from,
Right.
which I think helps us think about how the passages in which Gadamer is trying to fight off that charge of relativism work. That he's not just addressing the charge head on. He's saying, no, the whole problematic you're dealing with here rests on these other assumptions that I'm trying to challenge. And I felt like he said that maybe more clearly here in this paragraph than I'd seen him say it anywhere else, and just found that helpful as a tip for
You have
reading
time
other
for one little
things.
story about Gadamer, about this very
There's
point?
always time for a story, John. That's all got
Okay. Okay. I drove to all these lectures like for 3 years, like, and so I'd sit there, and he was at this philosophy department, and eventually at the end of it, someone, sort of was arguing that he was a relativist, and then somebody else came in, and then the Q&A, how anyway they kind of ganged up on him, and sort of, and he just stopped everything. He says he says, "Do you have a prophet?" And that was a complete non sequitur. Nobody could answer it. In other words, you've got someone with the absolute truth,
Hmm.
show him to me. Bring me to your. That was his answer. That was
Right.
his quick put down.
Yeah.
And I think there's something profound there. Because in order to talk about relativism, you have to assume there is an absolute truth.
Mm-hmm. Something unconditioned, something historically unconditioned.
Yeah.
That's the contrast. That shows why being historically conditioned is a problem.
Because he had tried to explain it like very, very patiently and very nicely, and he finally got pissed off. He says, "Do you have a prophet?"
All right.
Anyway,
Well, I hope this
there it is.
conversation has been a profit in the other sense of the word. Thanks for everybody for coming. It's good to talk to you again. We will be meeting again in 2 months. So that will be June, in mid-June. And if you have essays, or we've never read part of Truth and Method or part of other books, if you have something that you really like for us to discuss, just send it to me and I'll add it to the list, and we can vote on it, and that can take that up in June. All right. Thanks, everyone.
And submit your stuff to NAS.
And make your
Your
stuff to
next
NAS. That's
conference.
right. Thanks, Greg.